Welcome back to Not So Obvious Watches. I'm Pete McConville, and today I'm going to talk about the issue of too many Skus. This is in some ways a kind of Tim Nsow versus Ariel Adams smackdown, drag him out fight, which is not really true because in a sense they talk past each other, but they do represent two different sides of this question of having too many Skus. Quickly, a SKU is a stock keeping unit. It's basically just the little line that someone will keep to keep track of a particular kind of watch or a particular item that they have in their inventory. So if you're Breitling and you've introduced 70 new watches this year, which they have, then you'll have 70 new Skus. Now, in short, there's been an ongoing criticism of a number of companies, and I've mentioned one already, Breitling, which Tim Nsow has frankly kind of sunk the boot into a couple of times, and Longines, which Federico over on Federico Talks Watches has got into, that there is too many SKUs, too many items in their inventory, which leads to confusion over just what it is that is the brand's identity and dilutes what they stand for. And this is a massive issue where increasingly we relate to brands as if they were our football team. We want to feel an emotional connection to that brand. And if that brand is kind of diluted across a vast array of different areas, then that emotional connection becomes diluted as well. So you can sort of see where they're coming from when we talk about having too many SKUs and lots of SKUs being a problem, in that it dilutes our connection to the brand. Now, the flip side of that is a recent podcast I listened to from Ariel Adams, and I'll find a link and put it in the show note the show notes below. I think it was with Oster Jewelry or Oster Watches. Like I said, I'll find the link and put it in the below. And he made almost the exact opposite complaint, that increasingly brands were being focused on this one-size-fits-all approach to their range and didn't appear to be catering to the fact that there are lots of different markets with lots of different design needs. And that becomes, those two issues are in direct competition with each other, which is, how do I maintain consistency of message, consistency of approach, whilst at the same time recognizing that vast amounts of the world have quite different approaches and quite different tastes in watch. Now, I suppose one option is to be Rolex and have sufficient gravitas that you define such a significant portion of the watch market that frankly the market bends to you rather than the other way around. But I think there's possibly only two companies that can pull that off, and they would be Rolex and probably Patek, maybe AP, Audemars Piguet, probably not Vacheron, although maybe they could, I don't know. But really, as large companies, I mean, if you're a small player like FP Journe, this is not an issue, but for large companies, it's quite difficult, unless you're like one of the Trinity or Rolex, to make the world bend around you. The other option is to be a small company, is to surrender to the idea that your watches are only going to appeal to one or two markets and simply put a line through everyone else. And sometimes you look at a company like Ulysse Nardin and I find myself asking, is that what they've done? Have they said, we have a specific design aesthetic, we have a particular look, we have a particular demographic, most of which is like Eastern Europe and Asia, and we don't give a toss about Western Europe. You know, our watches are made fun of, don't care, don't sell them anyway, that's what we'll do. Maybe that's their approach. But if you're a large mainstream company that wants to be a major player and operate in lots of markets, you've got a problem. Chase all the different markets, dilute your brand. Don't chase all the different markets and you're consigned to a niche market. So how do you manage this conundrum? Now, the first thing I'd note is that this is really only a problem for watch geeks, people who are invested in the watch community, watch videos, that sort of thing. Normal people couldn't give a rat's. So this is my suggestion, and it's done with the idea that what you're trying to do is appeal to a relatively small group of people who I think are important because, frankly, we watch geeks often kind of have direct or at least indirect influence on the way other people act around watches. So this is my suggestion for the brands. Lie to us. Don't tell us the truth. Come up with a story. And in some ways, this is not a particularly exotic idea because there's a number of companies, and I'll name Seiko and in partnership with Hodinkee, who effectively are doing this already. And what I mean by that is they create essentially fake local markets, a fake Japanese domestic market and a fake American only market for particular watches, but then make them available to anyone. And that's actually a really smart idea. This idea that you said, what we're going to do is slice and dice our inventory and just arbitrarily stick it in different markets, but actually have it available to everyone, has a way of diminishing what appears to be the size of your inventory, whilst at the same time having a large inventory. Now, the first thing, let me say, is this is going to be risky. If you get it wrong, you run the serious risk of offending a whole bunch of people, and you're going to have to manage it really carefully to avoid any kind of racist stereotyping. So if you were to take a particular style of watch and have it overtly, for example, Asian, and then drop it in the Asian market, and then have very specific kinds of messaging, that could go completely wrong. So I think the answer is probably not to say too much about what you do. For example, Seiko never says why certain watches that it has are Japanese domestic market only. It just seems to arbitrarily decide that all our interesting coloured monsters are going to be JDM and lock them away, and then make them available to everyone via alternative channels. Another method of rather just ignoring it could be to make divisions of the market kind of arbitrary, or quite obviously linked strictly to the market that it's selling in. And I'll give an example of what could be done, and it's a slight play on what has occurred. Breitling have recently introduced a series of watches. They're reimaginings of an old Navitimer, recast with the colours of period airlines. So there's a TWA, a Pan Am, and a Swiss Air one. Now, I'll fiddle with this a little bit. And imagine they issued a Swiss Air one, which is European, and then they put that one on the European website, but not any of the American or Asian websites. And then they created a Pan Am one, and they put that on the American website, but not on the Asian or EU website. And then, they didn't create a JAL, but imagine they created a JAL version, so Japanese Airlines, and then put that on the Japanese, made that Japanese domestic market only, put that on the Japanese website, but not the others. And so what you could do, and then what you need to do then is come up with a system where those in the know, those watch geeks like us, can find them and can access them and can buy them. But at a glance, they're not all on the same page at the same time. Now, you do run the risk of annoying your customers this way, and I'm in that boat. It's really annoying when you want that bright green, the Nemo, the bright green clownfish coloured sumo diver, and it's kind of locked away. So the secret is you have to make it, you can't annoy them too much. You can't turn them off your customer. They have to be able to find it. So you've got to have some separation, but that separation ultimately needs to be fake. So what you might do is target initial distribution and initial marketing to a specific region. So if you produce the Pan Am variant of the Breitling Navitimer, you market that in America, and you send most of the models over to America, and you push the Pan Am one there, and then you push the Swiss Air one in Europe. But at the same time, maybe what you do is through, for example, your boutiques, you make it known that there are other variants and that these other variants can be ordered through the boutique. Maybe you create a stripped down kind of business to business style international website that, you know, the geeks can kind of find. You don't have it in big banners, but you make it so it can be found, and then through that the geeks can identify that there's a whole bunch of other watches that they could get access to. Have some sort of link which again takes you maybe back to your local distributor in your region, maybe through a boutique in your region, and which enables you to order these in so that they are available to you. You've just got to do a little bit of work. Now this is risky. You do run the risk of getting the division wrong and upsetting people. You run the risk of making it a little bit too hard and turning people off your brand. But on the other hand, this approach also creates opportunities. First off, it allows brands to better shape their inventories and perhaps even their identities on a region by region basis. So if you are Longines, for example, and you are huge pretty much around the world, but in the different parts of the world, people have a different idea of who you are. In China, from what I understand, they're big into, I can't remember the word, but essentially couples watches. So plainer watches that would be quite modern, a little bit plainer, where there's a large size and a smaller size, and a couple will buy both. That's quite an Asian, particularly quite a Chinese practice. It's big. Longines make a lot of sales that way, but what it means is they end up with a lot of watches in their inventory which don't seem to make sense when picked up and moved over into a Western construct. Conversely, and I have no idea how the Asian market looks at the heritage line from Longines. Maybe they love it, maybe they hate it, I don't know. For the purposes of this, let's imagine that the Asian market doesn't particularly like the heritage lines, just for the sake of the argument. Then what Longines could do would be clearly create two completely different identities, significantly push those watches which Federico and Tim Mosso and all the Western YouTubers love, which is the heritage line, push that, make that the center of everything, and then make you have to work quite hard to get to those watches which are not big in the West and which you don't want to emphasize. So that essentially, if you wanted to imagine that Longines in the West had 30 different SKUs instead of 80 or 90 different SKUs, you could do that quite easily. Conversely, over in the East, over in Asia, Longines could do exactly the opposite. They could emphasize one set of watches, these couples watches and other things which are big sellers over there, and they could de-emphasize the heritage lines, still make them available, but push them down. So you get to shape your identity by market. And that what the number one issue that also does is it simply it attacks that issue of having too many SKUs in a market and an identity dilution, hits that on the head straight away. But the number three, and I think this is kind of cool, is by making the brand, by having this kind of slightly gamifying the process of finding everything that a watch company has and then creating an alternative approach to that company. So in order to access some specific models, you have to go just a little bit further, perhaps engage with a boutique or something like that. You can actually enhance the engagement of these people with the brand. You can make them feel more connected to you because they had to work a little bit for the relationship. Now you have to be really careful and don't go too far. There's any number of YouTubers out there who tell you how much you have to schmooze up to your local AD to get your hands on a Rolex, and as a result there's actually significant blowback on Rolex. And they don't care, they're selling every watch they possibly can get, but there is a fair bit of ill will towards Rolex over that need to have to schmooze. That's going too far to they're making it too hard to get a watch. But I think if you can get that right and have just the right amount of friction so that in order to access particular boutique pieces, I don't need to be spending $100,000. I don't need to be necessarily like running a big channel constantly talking about these watches in order to get the invite to buy a stainless steel sports watch. But it could be a case of I really do have to find my local AD, I have to send them an email, I have to kind of do some research. That's not hard. And I think a lot of people at the end of that would actually feel quite rewarded if just going through a couple of these steps was suddenly able to get a watch which is not all over the high street in whatever your local market is. Suddenly you're able to be the cool kid, accessing a watch which quite frankly would probably never have sold much in your region anyway, quite frankly would have probably just molded on someone's some normal jeweller's or AD's desk for ages and ages and ages. But in this case, you were able to find it, get it, feel special, feel engaged with the brand, and the brand didn't have all that overhead of having to carry a whole bunch of stock that actually drags the reputation of the brand down. Now, here's the thing. Is this worth it? Is it worth brands having regional markets, dividing the world up this way, having to have multiple inventories and probably an extra layer of sort of customer service that they have to go through and second guess and sort of double think a lot of these things? Frankly, I don't know. I'm not an industry analyst. I don't know how all this works. Maybe the brands have worked out that it's just not worth it. They'll just have this one single big inventory. They'll cop a bit of shit from some YouTubers about having too much, but they'll take it on the chin and move on. That said, I suspect it is worth it. I suspect that by having this kind of chain, you can reduce the amount of excess inventory. You can avoid the problem of having to sell huge amounts of watches to markets where they won't sell, and in fact may have a negative effect on your brand equity. And I think that's the last point. Too many brands for too long have ignored the importance of brand equity and brand engagement with their customers. And probably I'll put those two things together and say too many brands for too long have ignored the power of engagement to create brand equity. And I think this idea of trimming down how you present yourself in each market, being more disciplined about the messaging that you send, whilst at the same time creating a channel for those people who are really keen, who really want to be involved, to have a, let's be honest, let's call it a special relationship with you, where they're able to get a watch that others might find a little bit harder. Not because they've got more money, not because they put more money through the AD, but simply they know a little bit more, they're a little bit more into watches, they're prepared to do just a little bit more chasing and research. Very little cost to the makers. I think there could be an enormous payoff, and I think that payoff will come because you will slowly but surely gather more engaged and more committed customers who will be with you for the long term. So I think that's the answer. I don't think the answer to an organisation like Breitling or Longines is to reduce their SKUs. I agree with Ariel Adams. What they need to do is double down on it. Have a watch for everyone. But I also agree with Tim Nsow that they need to think very carefully about how do they represent that so that they don't overwhelm people with the number of watches available and they don't dilute their message. And I think the answer is to slice your market up, but create channels between those markets for the dedicated person to use. So that's my idea. Might be complete rubbish. I'm not a marketeer. I don't do this for a living. It's just me looking at problems and seeing a potential answer. What do you think? Do you think, would you like that? Do you like what you can do with Seiko, where there are clearly Japanese domestic market products that are clearly available to anyone in the world who goes to Japan Shop Online or Noman Watches? Let me know in the comments. I've been Pete McConville. This has been Not So Obvious Watches. A little bit of a tangent, but I'm going to do more and more of these. I'm getting bored with the standard kind of blog stuff, and I'm going to just try and talk about stuff I enjoy. And this is kind of stuff I enjoy. So if you do too, please like and subscribe, and I'll catch you later. Bye.